Marcus Wellington stares at a simple signature on a business contract, not knowing that this moment will shatter everything he believed about his identity and destroy the empire he spent 30 years building. What happens next will test every relationship he's ever valued and reveal a family secret that will force him to choose between the fortune that defines him and the love he's been searching for his entire life. A story that proves blood isn't always thicker than water and will make you believe that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. The crystal tumbler slipped from Marcus Wellington's fingers, amber whiskey spreading across the mahogany desk like liquid gold bleeding into expensive wood. His hands trembled as he stared at the signature on the contract before him, a signature that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, yet there it was, mocking him with its familiar flourishes. "Sir?" His assistant Sarah's voice seemed to come from another world. "Are you all right?" Marcus couldn't respond. The signature belonged to a man who had been dead for 15 years. His father, Harold Wellington, the steel magnate who had built Wellington Industries from nothing and left it to his only son. The same father who had taught Marcus that a man's word was his bond, that family came first, and that the Wellington name meant something in this world. But Harold Wellington had never signed documents with that particular flourish, the elaborate W that curved back on itself like a snake eating its own tail. Marcus knew this because he had studied his father's signature for years, practicing it, perfecting it, until he could forge it flawlessly, for the legal documents that kept the company running after Harold's stroke had left him unable to sign his own name. Only one person had ever signed documents that way. Only one person had that distinctive, almost arrogant curve to their signature. His uncle? Thomas, his father's estranged brother who had disappeared from the family 25 years ago after a bitter fight over the direction of the company. Thomas, who Harold claimed had died in a car accident in Europe, though they never found a body, never held a funeral. "Cancel my meetings," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah stepped closer, concern etched across her features. She had worked for the Wellington family for 8 years, had seen Marcus through the death of his father, through his messy divorce from Catherine, through the hostile takeover attempts and the market crashes. She had never seen him look like this, like a man who had just discovered his entire life was built on quicksand. "All of them, sir?" "All of them." Marcus stood abruptly, the chair rolling backward and hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of downtown Chicago. 40 floors below, people moved through their lives like ants, unaware that the man in the glass tower above them was having his world systematically dismantled by a simple signature on a land acquisition contract. The document itself was routine. Wellington Industries had been buying property on the south side for months, planning a massive development that would transform the neighborhood and generate millions in profit. Marcus had personally overseen every acquisition, every negotiation. He knew every property owner, every holdout, every detail of the deal, except this one. The property at 1247 Ashland Avenue had been owned by the same family for 60 years. The Kowalskis had finally agreed to sell after months of negotiations, and the contract had been signed 3 days ago. Marcus should have been celebrating. This was the last piece of the puzzle, the final domination of a project that would cement his legacy as more than just Harold Wellington's son. Instead, he was staring at evidence that his father had lied to him. That Thomas Wellington was alive, and that somehow impossibly his uncle had been involved in this deal. Marcus grabbed his coat from the closet, ignoring Sarah's questions about when he would return, about the board meeting scheduled for the following morning, about the investors flying in from Tokyo. None of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was finding out how a dead man had signed a contract 3 days ago. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt like descending into hell. Each floor that passed reminded Marcus of another lie he would have to confront, another certainty that had crumbled. The parking garage was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of city traffic. His hands shook as he tried to start the Bentley, the engine turning over with a purr that usually brought him satisfaction. Today it sounded like a funeral dirge. The drive to the south side took 23 minutes in afternoon traffic. 23 minutes. That felt like 23 years. Marcus had grown up hearing stories about this part of the city, about how his grandfather had started with a single steel mill here before Harold moved the operation to the industrial district. He had driven through these neighborhoods countless times, but never really seen them. The small houses with their postage-stamp lawns, the corner grocery stores with hand-painted signs, the children playing on sidewalks that would soon be demolished to make way for Wellington's vision of progress. 1247 Ashland Avenue was a modest two-story house with blue shutters and a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side. An elderly woman sat on the porch swing, watching him park the Bentley across the street with obvious curiosity. Marcus recognized her from the photographs in the acquisition file. Mrs. Agnes Kowalski, 78 years old, widow of a steelworker who had died in one of Harold Wellington's factories. She didn't seem surprised when he approached. "You must be Mr. Wellington," she said, her Polish accent still thick after 6 decades in America. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Mrs. Kowalski." Marcus extended his hand, which she shook with surprising firmness. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I had some questions about the sale." "Questions?" She gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Sit. You look like a man who's seen a ghost." If only she knew how accurate that assessment was. Marcus settled into the creaky wicker chair, suddenly feeling like the child he had been when his father first brought him to tour the steel mills. Small, overwhelmed, uncertain of his place in the adult world. "The signature on the contract," Marcus began carefully. "The one from Wellington Industries. I was hoping you could tell me about the person who signed it." Mrs. Kowalski's expression shifted, a shadow passing across her weathered features. "You don't know? I thought I did, but now I'm not sure of anything." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read people through decades of hardship and loss. Finally, she spoke. "He looked like you. Older, grayer, but the same eyes. Same stubborn jaw. He said his name was Thomas Wellington." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "When did you meet with him?" "Last week. He came to the house, sat right where you're sitting now. Said he wanted to make sure I understood the terms of the sale, that I wasn't being pressured into anything." Mrs. Kowalski's voice carried a note of something that might have been affection. "Most developers don't do that, you know. They send lawyers, assistants. They don't come themselves." Marcus felt the world tilt around him. His uncle, alive in Chicago, personally handling property acquisitions for Wellington Industries. But that was impossible. Harold had been adamant about Thomas's death, had shown. Marcus, the police reports from the European accident, had refused to discuss his brother for the rest of his life. When Marcus had pressed for details as a teenager, Harold had grown so angry that he'd locked himself in his study for 3 days. "Did he mention how he was connected to the company?" Marcus asked. "He said he was Harold Wellington's brother. Said he'd been away for a long time but was back to help with the family business." Mrs. Kowalski tilted her head. "He didn't mention you, though. I asked if Harold had children, and he just got this sad look and said the family was complicated." Complicated. That was one way to put it. Marcus's childhood had been built on the foundation of Wellington Industries, on the legacy his father was building for his son. Harold had worked 16-hour days, missed school plays and baseball games, sacrificed every relationship for the company that would one day belong to Marcus. He had justified it all by saying it was for the family, for the Wellington name, for the future. But if Thomas was alive, if he had been alive all these years, what did that mean for everything Harold had taught him? What did it mean for the company Marcus had inherited, the empire he had expanded, the identity he had built around being Harold Wellington's only heir? "Mrs. Kowalski," Marcus said slowly, "did Thomas say anything else? About where he's been, why he came back?" "He said he owed someone a debt, that he'd made mistakes when he was younger and was trying to make amends." She paused, her fingers working at the hem of her sweater. "He also said something strange. He said that sometimes the only way to save something you love is to destroy it first." The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Thomas had always been the more philosophical of the Wellington brothers, according to the few family stories Harold had shared before the falling out. Where Harold was practical and direct, Thomas had been a dreamer, An idealist who believed business should serve people rather than the other way around. It was that fundamental disagreement that had torn the brothers apart, leading to Thomas's departure from both the company and the family. Did he leave any way to contact him? Mrs. Kowalski shook her head. But he said he'd be in touch soon, said there were other properties he needed to handle personally. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Mr. Wellington, I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life. I've seen developers come and go, seen promises made and broken. But your uncle, he was different. He seemed to actually care about what happened to the people here. Marcus thanked Mrs. Kowalski and returned to his car, his mind racing. If Thomas was handling multiple properties personally, there would be a trail. Real estate transactions left paper trails, required meetings with lawyers, involved bank transfers. His uncle couldn't have been operating completely in the shadows. Back at Wellington Tower, Marcus bypassed his office and headed directly to the legal department on the 32nd floor. The law firm of Morrison, Chen & Associates had handled Wellington Industries' legal affairs for over a decade, and their lead partner, David Morrison, had been Harold's personal attorney and friend. If anyone would have information about unusual property acquisitions, it would be David. Marcus found him in his corner office, reviewing contracts by the light of a green banker's lamp that seemed ridiculously old-fashioned in the modern glass and steel environment of the tower. Marcus, David looked up with genuine pleasure. I wasn't expecting you. How can I help? David, I need you to pull all the property acquisition files for the South Side development. Specifically, I need to know if there have been any unusual signings, any contracts handled outside normal channels. David's expression grew cautious. Is there a problem with one of the deals? I'm not sure yet, but I need to see everything. Every signature, every meeting record, every communication with property owners. David nodded and moved to his computer, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Here we are, 12 properties total, acquired over the past 8 months. Most of them went through standard channels. Our junior associates handled the negotiations. Everything was processed through the normal approval chains. Most of them. Well, there are 3 properties that were handled differently. The paperwork shows they were signed by a Wellington Industries representative, but they bypassed our office entirely. The contracts came back already executed with instructions to process them immediately. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Which properties? 1247 Ashland Avenue, 892 Blue Island, and 1433 Racine. All 3 owned by elderly residents, all 3 with slightly above market offers. David pulled up the digital files. The signatures are legitimate. I verified them against the corporate signature cards we have on file, but the process was unusual. Can I see the signature cards? David hesitated. Marcus, those are confidential documents. Even for you, I'd need written authorization. David. Marcus's voice carried the authority of a man who had just inherited billions and wasn't used to being told no. My family owns this company. I think I have the right to see who's been signing contracts on our behalf. After a moment's consideration, David pulled out a locked filing cabinet and retrieved a manila folder marked Wellington Industries, Authorized Signatures. Inside were photocopies of signature cards dating back to the company's incorporation, including Harold's original signature from 1975, Marcus's signature from when he joined the company in 2010, and several signatures from long-term employees who had been granted limited signing authority. And there, on a card dated just 6 months ago, was Thomas Wellington's signature. The same elaborate W that Marcus had seen on the Kowalski contract, the same flowing script that had haunted him for the past 3 hours. David, Marcus said quietly, who authorized this signature card? David checked the file. His face went pale. According to the records, it was authorized by Harold Wellington. That's impossible. My father died 5 years ago. I know that, Marcus, but this signature card is dated 6 months ago, and it's signed with Harold's authorization code, the code that only he and you know. Marcus felt the room spinning around him. Harold's authorization code was a 6-digit number that his father had created when Marcus joined the company. a security measure to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive documents. Harold had made Marcus memorize the number, but had never written it down anywhere, claiming that the fewer people who knew it, the safer the company would be. Only 2 people in the world knew that number, Marcus and his dead father. Except apparently, that wasn't true. "I need copies of everything," Marcus said. "Every document, every signature card, every piece of paper related to these 3 properties." David nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Marcus, if there's something irregular happening with the company's legal documents, we need to contact the authorities. This could affect every contract we've signed, No authorities, not yet." Marcus was already moving toward the door. "Just get me the files. And David, this conversation never happened." Marcus spent the next 2 hours in his office, spreading documents across his conference table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture. The more he studied the evidence, the more questions arose. Thomas's signature card had been processed through proper channels, using Harold's authorization code and following all corporate protocols. The property acquisitions were legitimate, fair market deals that actually benefited the sellers. There was no evidence of fraud or manipulation, but there was also no explanation for how a dead man could have authorized his brother's return to the company, or how that brother had known details about Wellington Industries' operations that should have been impossible for an outsider to obtain. Marcus was so absorbed in the documents that he didn't hear Sarah knock on his office door. She had to clear her throat twice before he looked up. "Sir, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's about family business." "Sarah, I told you I wasn't taking any meetings. He said his name is Thomas Wellington." The world stopped. Marcus looked up to find a man standing in his doorway, a man who looked like an older, weathered version of himself. The same dark hair now streaked with silver, the same strong jaw now softened by time and what looked like years of worry, the same green eyes, but where Marcus's held the sharp confidence of a man who had never known real failure, this man's eyes carried the weight of secrets and sorrow. "Hello, nephew," Thomas Wellington said softly. "I think we need to talk." Sarah retreated quickly, closing the office door behind her with a soft click that sounded like the closing of a coffin lid. Marcus stood frozen behind his desk, documents scattered around him like evidence of a crime he was only beginning to understand. "You're supposed to be dead," Marcus said finally. Thomas stepped further into the office, his movements careful and deliberate. He was wearing an expensive suit but carried himself with the slightly stooped posture of a man who had learned not to take up too much space in the world. "I suppose I am, officially. Harold did an excellent job of erasing me from the family history. He said you died in a car accident in France. Belgium, actually, and it wasn't a car accident." Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline with an expression that might have been nostalgia or regret. "It was a choice. Harold gave me 2 options: disappear completely and let the family believe I was dead, or stay and watch him destroy everything our father built." Marcus felt anger building in his chest, hot and familiar. "So you just left? You abandoned your family, your responsibilities, everything?" Thomas turned back to face him, and Marcus saw something in his uncle's expression that made him take a step back. It was pity, not anger, not defensiveness, but genuine sympathy for a man who still didn't understand what he was dealing with. "Marcus, what did your father tell you about Wellington Industries? About how it started, how it grew into what it is today?" "He told me, Grandfather started with a single steel mill on the south side. That dad grew it into the largest privately held industrial company in the Midwest through hard work and smart business decisions." Marcus's voice carried the pride of a man reciting a family legend he had never thought to question. He built something to last, something to pass down to his children. "And what did he tell you about me?" "That you were his younger brother, that you disagreed with his business philosophy and left the company, that you died in Europe before I was old enough to meet you." Thomas nodded slowly. He wasn't lying about the disagreement. We did have fundamentally different ideas about how to run the business. "But Marcus, did it ever occur to you to wonder why Wellington Industries has been so profitable? Why your father was able to expand so rapidly in the 1990s and 2000s when other industrial companies were struggling. Good management, strategic investments, taking, calculated risks that paid off. Calculated risks. Thomas's laugh was bitter. Is that what he called it? Marcus felt a familiar defensive anger rising in his chest. Throughout his childhood, he had heard whispered criticisms of his father's business methods, competitors who claimed Harold Wellington cut corners, employees who claimed they were treated unfairly, community leaders who questioned some of the company's environmental practices. Marcus had dismissed it all as jealousy from people who couldn't match his father's success. If you're here to criticize my father, you can leave. I don't know what game you're playing, but... Marcus, Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. I'm here because I owe Harold a debt, and because I owe you the truth that he never gave you. What truth? Thomas walked to Marcus's desk and picked up one of the property acquisition files. Do you know who used to live at these addresses before you bought the properties for your development project? Families, homeowners who were compensated fairly for their families whose fathers and grandfathers worked in Wellington Industries factories, families whose breadwinners died in industrial accidents that were covered up, families whose medical bills bankrupted them after they were exposed to chemicals that your father knew were dangerous but used anyway because they were cheaper than the safe alternatives. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. That's not true. Wellington Industries has an excellent safety record. We've won awards for workplace safety, awards that your father bought by bribing inspectors and falsifying safety reports. Marcus, I have documentation going back 30 years. Your father built his empire on the backs of working people. And when those people got sick or injured or died, he made sure their families disappeared from the neighborhoods where they might cause trouble. Marcus felt the room spinning around him. You're lying. I wish I were. Thomas pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket pocket. These are copies of documents I've been collecting for 25 years. Medical reports, safety inspections, payoff records, death certificates. All of it buried by your father's lawyers and accountants. Marcus didn't want to look at the papers Thomas was offering, didn't want to see whatever evidence his uncle claimed to have, but something in Thomas's manner, the quiet sadness, the lack of vindictive anger, made him take the envelope. The first document was a medical report dated 1987. Marcus recognized the letterhead of Chicago General Hospital. The report detailed the treatment of a steelworker named Robert Kowalski, Mrs. Kowalski's husband, who had been admitted with severe chemical burns after an accident at Wellington Industries' South Side facility. The burns were caused by exposure to an industrial solvent that, according to the report, should have been handled with protective equipment that the workers had not been provided. The second document was an internal memo from Harold Wellington to the plant manager, dated 3 days after Robert Kowalski's accident. The memo authorized a payment of $50,000 to the Kowalski family in exchange for their agreement not to pursue legal action or speak publicly about the accident. It also authorized the immediate purchase of safer chemical alternatives that Harold had previously rejected as unnecessarily expensive. The third document was Robert Kowalski's death certificate, dated 6 months later. Cause of death, complications from chemical exposure. Marcus set the papers down with shaking hands. This doesn't prove anything. Industrial accidents happen. Companies settle lawsuits to avoid bad publicity all the time. Keep reading. Marcus didn't want to keep reading, but he couldn't stop himself. Document after document painted a picture of systematic negligence, cover-ups, and payoffs. Workers who had died from asbestos exposure in factories where Harold had delayed installing required safety equipment. Families who had been quietly relocated after their children developed respiratory problems from living downwind of Wellington facilities. Environmental reports that had been falsified to hide illegal dumping of toxic waste. By the time Marcus reached the bottom of the stack, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the papers. The last document was a letter, written in Harold's distinctive handwriting and dated just 2 months before his death. Thomas, the letter read, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've decided to come back. I know you think I destroyed our family's legacy, But everything I did was to protect what our father built. Yes, I made compromises. Yes, people were hurt. But the alternative was to let the company die along with the old ways of doing business. I chose to adapt, to survive, to build something that would last for Marcus and his children. You chose your conscience over your family. History will judge which of us was right. But if you've come back to destroy what I built, remember that you'll be destroying Marcus's future along with it. He's a good man, better than both of us. He deserves the chance to make his own choices about what the Wellington name will mean. Don't take that away from him out of spite for me. Harold. Marcus set the letter down and looked up to find Thomas watching him with an expression of infinite patience, like a doctor waiting for a patient to accept a terminal diagnosis. He knew you were alive, Marcus said quietly. We stayed in contact. Not often and never directly, but yes, Harold knew where I was and what I was doing. What were you doing? Thomas moved to one of the leather chairs across from Marcus's desk and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. Trying to make amends. I spent 25 years tracking down the families that Wellington Industries had hurt, trying to help them in ways that couldn't be traced back to the company. Anonymous donations to medical bills, college scholarships for children whose parents had died in our factories, grants to community organizations in neighborhoods we had poisoned. Our factories, you left the company. I left the management, Marcus. I never stopped being a Wellington. This company, these responsibilities, the damage we caused, it's all mine as much as it was Harold's. I may have disagreed with his methods, but I was complicit in the early years. I helped build the foundation that he later expanded through corruption. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the weight of revelations that kept piling on top of each other. His father, the man he had idolized, whose approval he had spent his entire life trying to earn, was not the honorable businessman Marcus had believed him to be. The company Marcus had inherited was built on a foundation of worker exploitation and environmental destruction. The fortune he had grown up with was blood money, extracted from the suffering of people whose names he had never known. Why are you telling me this now? Marcus asked. Why not let me continue in ignorance? Because you're about to make the same mistakes Harold made. This Southside development project, do you know what you're planning to build on those sites? Luxury condominiums, mixed-use commercial and residential space. It's a revitalization project that will bring jobs and investment to a depressed area. Luxury condominiums that the current residents will never be able to afford. Commercial space that will drive out the small businesses that have served the community for decades. You're calling it revitalization, but you're really talking about gentrification, pushing out poor families to make room for wealthy ones. Marcus felt his defensive anger returning. That's not true. We've included affordable housing units in the development plan. We've committed to hiring local workers for construction jobs. 20% affordable housing that will still be too expensive for most current residents. Construction jobs that will last 2 years before the workers are laid off again. Marcus, I've read your development plans. They're beautiful, innovative, profitable, and they'll destroy a community that's been struggling to survive for decades. That's not my fault. Economic change is inevitable. At least our development will bring investment and opportunity. Opportunity for whom? Thomas leaned forward, his voice growing more intense. Marcus, do you know why I came back now? Why I risked exposing myself after 25 years of hiding? Marcus shook his head. Because Agnes Kowalski called me. She has a phone number that I gave her husband 40 years ago when I was still working at the company and trying to help workers who had been hurt by our negligence. She told me that Wellington Industries was buying up the entire neighborhood, and she was scared about what would happen to the families who couldn't afford to move anywhere else. The mention of Mrs. Kowalski hit Marcus like a physical blow. The elderly woman who had sat on her sagging porch, who had spoken kindly about Thomas's visit, who had seemed resigned to losing the home where she had lived for 6 decades. She wasn't just a property seller. She was a widow whose husband had died because of Harold Wellington's cost-cutting measures, a woman who had been quietly struggling to survive on the insurance settlement that Harold had offered to buy her silence. She's been waiting for me to make things right for 25 years, Thomas continued. And now you're about to finish what your father started. erasing the last traces of the families we destroyed, replacing their community with profits for people who already have more money than they know what to do with. Marcus stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking down at the city that his family had helped shape through decades of industrial growth. From 40 floors up, the people below looked insignificant, their individual struggles invisible. It was easy to make decisions about their lives when you couldn't see their faces, when you thought of them as statistics rather than human beings. But Marcus could see Mrs. Kowalski's face. He could hear the resignation in her voice when she talked about selling her house, the careful way she had spoken about Thomas's kindness, the decades of patience she had shown while waiting for justice that never came. "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked without turning around. "I want you to stop the development. I want you to use Wellington Industries' resources to help the South Side community instead of destroying it. I want you to be better than Harold and I were." Marcus turned back to face his uncle. "And if I refuse? Then I'll go public with everything. The documents, the cover-ups, the systematic exploitation of workers. I'll destroy Wellington Industries and everything you've built." The threat hung in the air between them, like a knife blade catching the light. Marcus felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger he had felt as a child when playground bullies tried to intimidate him, the same fury that had driven him to excel in business school and prove that he was more than just Harold Wellington's privileged son. "You're trying to blackmail me," Marcus said. "I'm trying to save you." "Marcus, I watched Harold become the kind of man who could justify anything in the name of family and business success. I watched him rationalize every compromise, every cover-up, every decision that put profits ahead of people. I don't want to watch you make the same choices. My father built an empire. He created thousands of jobs, supported dozens of communities, contributed millions to charity. Maybe his methods weren't perfect, but the results were that good people died, Marcus. Children grew up without fathers. Families lost their homes. Entire neighborhoods were poisoned. You can't justify that with job creation statistics." Marcus felt the argument they were having was familiar, like an echo of conversations that had taken place in this very office decades before. Harold and Thomas fighting over the soul of the company and the meaning of the Wellington name. Two brothers who had loved each other but couldn't find a way to reconcile their different visions of what business and family should mean. "What happened between you and my father?" Marcus asked. "What was the final fight that made him fake your death?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memories that were clearly painful to revisit. There was a fire at the Southside plant in 1999, equipment malfunction caused by deferred maintenance that Harold had ordered to cut costs. 3 workers died, including a 22-year-old kid named David Chen, whose wife was pregnant with their first child. David Chen. Marcus knew that name from somewhere but couldn't place it. "I went to Harold after the funerals and told him we had to shut down operations until we could afford to bring all our facilities up to proper safety standards. I told him we had to accept responsibility for the deaths, compensate the families properly, and change how we did business. He refused, said it would bankrupt the company and destroy everything our father had built." Thomas stood up and walked to the bookshelf where Harold had kept his collection of business biographies and management texts. "So, I went to the families myself. I told them the truth about the safety violations, helped them get lawyers, made sure they knew their rights. Harold found out and gave me a choice: disappear and let him handle things his way, or stay and watch him destroy both the families and the company through a prolonged legal battle that would benefit no one. And you chose to disappear. I chose to let him think I had disappeared. I actually stayed in Chicago for another 6 months, working behind the scenes to make sure the families got fair settlements and that David Chen's widow had what she needed to raise her son alone." Thomas pulled a book from the shelf, a biography of Andrew Carnegie that Harold had read and reread throughout Marcus's childhood. "By the time I actually left Chicago, Harold had spread the story about my death in Europe. It was easier for everyone if people believed I was gone. David Chen." The name clicked into place for Marcus now. David Morrison, the lawyer who had shown him Thomas's signature card just hours earlier. Morrison, Chen and Associates. David Chen's son had grown up to become Wellington Industries' lead attorney. the man who handled all the company's most sensitive legal matters. Does David Morrison know? Marcus asked. He knows his father died in a Wellington Industries accident. He doesn't know the details of the cover-up or my role in exposing it. Harold was very careful to ensure that David's anger was directed at abstract corporate negligence rather than specific individuals. Is that why you came back? Because David is involved in the Southside project? Thomas smiled sadly. David Morrison is one of the most ethical lawyers I've ever met. He became everything his father would have wanted him to be, despite growing up without him. But he's working for a company built on the foundation of his father's death, representing interests that are about to harm more families the same way his family was harmed. The irony is profound. Marcus felt the weight of accumulated secrets and lies pressing down on him like a physical force. Every relationship he had, every business decision he made, every assumption about his family's legacy was built on deceptions that went back decades. The company he had spent his adult life expanding was a machine designed to extract wealth from vulnerable people. The father he had idolized was a man who had chosen profits over human life repeatedly and systematically. And now he was being asked to choose between continuing that legacy or destroying everything he had ever known. There has to be another way, Marcus said, some compromise that doesn't require me to dismantle my father's life's work. What if his life's work was fundamentally wrong? What if the empire he built was always destined to collapse because it was constructed on a foundation of lies? Before Marcus could answer, there was a knock on his office door. Sarah's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Wellington, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been an incident at the Southside construction site. Someone needs to speak with you immediately. Marcus looked at Thomas, who had gone pale. What kind of incident? A protest, sir. About a dozen residents, mostly elderly people. They've chained themselves to the construction equipment and are refusing to leave. The police are on scene, but they're requesting instructions from you before they take any action. Marcus closed his eyes. After everything he had learned in the past few hours, the last thing he needed was a public confrontation with the very families Thomas claimed Wellington Industries had been systematically harming. Did they say what they want? They're demanding to speak with someone from the Wellington family about the development project. They say they won't leave until they get answers about what's going to happen to the neighborhood families who can't afford the new housing. Thomas and Marcus looked at each other across the office that had once belonged to Harold Wellington, the man whose legacy was simultaneously bringing them together and tearing them apart. You have to choose now, Thomas said quietly. You can call the police and have those families arrested for trespassing on your property. Or you can go down there and listen to what they have to say. Marcus thought about Mrs. Kowalski sitting on her sagging porch and talking about a man who had seemed to actually care about what happened to the people in her neighborhood. He thought about David Morrison, working late in his office to process contracts that would transform the community where his father had died. He thought about Harold Wellington, writing letters to his estranged brother and justifying a lifetime of moral compromises as necessary sacrifices for family and business. If I go down there, Marcus said, will you come with me? Thomas nodded. If you want me to. I want you to. I think it's time I started learning the truth about what it means to be a Wellington. The drive to the South Side took longer than usual because of rush hour traffic, giving Marcus time to process the surreal situation he found himself in. 6 hours ago, he had been a successful businessman focused on completing a profitable real estate development. Now he was driving toward a confrontation with protesters, while accompanied by the uncle he had believed dead for his entire adult life, carrying documents that proved his father had built the family fortune through systematic exploitation of working families. Thomas sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally giving directions to navigate around construction and traffic delays. Marcus found himself studying his uncle's profile, looking for resemblances to Harold that he had never had the chance to notice before. The same way of drumming fingers on his knee when thinking, the same habit of checking his watch even when time wasn't particularly important, the same careful way of choosing words before speaking. You look like him, Marcus said as they turned onto Ashland Avenue. More than I expected. People used to say we could have been twins, Despite the age difference, Harold was always bigger, more commanding, but we had the same mannerisms. Thomas's voice carried a note of old sadness. It made our mother happy, I think. She used to say we were two halves of the same person. Harold had the ambition, I had the conscience. What happened to that balance when you left? Thomas was quiet for a moment. I think that's what you're about to find out. The construction site was a study in contrasts. On one side, enormous machinery sat idle, bulldozers and excavators that represented millions of dollars in development investment. On the other side, a small group of protesters had arranged themselves around the equipment with the kind of quiet determination that spoke of people who had nothing left to lose. Marcus counted 13 people, mostly women over 60, some with adult children who looked like they had taken time off work to be there. They had brought folding chairs and homemade signs, and someone had set up a card table with thermoses of coffee and what looked like homemade sandwiches. It was less like a protest and more like a neighborhood gathering that happened to be taking place on a construction site. Police cars surrounded the area with their lights flashing, but the officers seemed more confused than confrontational. This clearly wasn't the kind of situation they were trained for. Elderly ladies having what amounted to a picnic while chained to heavy machinery. Marcus parked the Bentley half a block away, and he and Thomas walked toward the scene together. Marcus could feel curious eyes following their progress, neighbors coming out of houses to see what was happening, construction workers standing around uncertain whether they should stay or go home, reporters who had apparently gotten word of the protest and were setting up cameras. As they got closer, Marcus could see Mrs. Kowalski at the center of the group, sitting in a folding chair beside a bulldozer with a chain wrapped around her waist and padlocked to the machine's track. She looked up as they approached, and her face showed no surprise at seeing Marcus again, but her eyes widened when she recognized Thomas. "Mr. Wellington," she called out, and Marcus wasn't sure which of them she was addressing. "Thank you for coming." The police sergeant in charge of the scene approached Marcus before he could reach the protesters. "Are you the property owner, sir?" "I represent Wellington Industries, yes. These folks are trespassing on your construction site. We can arrest them if you want to press charges, but..." The sergeant glanced back at the group of elderly protesters. "Well, it's not exactly a dangerous situation. They're not hurting anything, except your construction schedule." Marcus looked at the protesters, really looked at them for the first time. They weren't angry or confrontational. They were just tired. The deep, bone-weary exhaustion of people who had spent their lives fighting battles they weren't equipped to win, but they were still fighting. "Give me a few minutes to talk to them first," Marcus said. The sergeant nodded and stepped back, but Marcus could see other officers positioning themselves strategically around the site. This situation could escalate quickly if he made the wrong choice. Marcus and Thomas walked together toward the group of protesters. The conversations that had been happening around the card table died away as people realized who was approaching. Marcus felt like he was walking toward a jury that was about to render a verdict on his entire life. "Mrs. Kowalski," Marcus said when they were close enough to speak without shouting. "I understand you wanted to speak with someone from Wellington Industries." "I wanted to speak with someone from the Wellington family," she corrected. "Someone who could give us honest answers about what's going to happen to the families in this neighborhood." "I'm here. What do you want to know?" An African-American woman in her 50s sitting chained to an excavator spoke up. "We want to know if you really believe 20% affordable housing is enough for a community where most people make less than $30,000 a year." The question hit Marcus harder than he expected because it forced him to confront numbers he had treated as abstractions. 20% affordable housing had sounded reasonable in board meetings and development presentations, but when he thought about Mrs. Kowalski trying to afford an apartment that cost more than her monthly Social Security check, the mathematics of displacement became personal. The affordable housing units will be subsidized to ensure they're accessible to current residents, Marcus said, falling back on the language his development team had prepared for community meetings. "Subsidized by whom?" asked a Hispanic man who looked to be in his 60s. "And what happens to the subsidy when the government changes its mind about funding? Or when Wellington Industries decides it's not profitable anymore?" Marcus didn't have an answer for that. because he had never asked the question. The affordable housing component of the development had been designed to satisfy city regulations and community relations requirements, not to provide permanent solutions for displaced families. "And what about the businesses?" asked another woman. "Rodriguez's grocery store has been in this neighborhood for 30 years. Martinez's auto shop employs 8 people from the community. The church where my grandmother was married, where I was married, where my children were baptized. What happens to all of that?" Again, Marcus found himself without words. The development plans called for new commercial space, but that space would be designed for upscale retail and professional services that could afford higher rents. There was no provision for existing businesses to transition to the new development, no consideration of the community institutions that would be displaced. Thomas stepped forward. "May I ask you something?" he said to the group. "How many of you have family members who worked for Wellington Industries over the years?" Hands went up around the circle, not all of them, but most. Mrs. Kowalski raised her hand. The African-American woman raised hers, the Hispanic man, and 3 others. "And how many of those family members were injured or made sick by their work at Wellington facilities?" The hands stayed up. Thomas looked at Marcus. "These aren't strangers whose property you're buying, nephew. These are the families of people who helped build Wellington Industries. People whose labor created the wealth you inherited." Marcus felt something shifting inside him, like a foundation that had been slowly undermining, finally giving way completely. All his life he had thought of Wellington Industries as his father's creation, built through Harold's vision and determination. But standing in this circle of protesters, surrounded by the faces of people whose families had paid the real cost of that success, he began to understand that the company had been built through collective sacrifice, most of it involuntary. "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked the group. Mrs. Kowalski struggled to her feet, the chain around her waist clanking as she moved. "We want you to remember that this neighborhood isn't just a development opportunity. It's a community. People have built their lives here, raised their children here, buried their parents here. If you're going to change everything, we want to be part of deciding how it changes. We want real, affordable housing that people can actually afford," said the African-American woman. "We want space for the businesses that serve this community. We want our children to be able to grow up in the neighborhood where their families have lived for generations. And we want Wellington Industries to acknowledge what happened to our families," said the Hispanic man. "My father died of lung cancer from asbestos exposure in your factory in 1994. The company gave my mother a settlement that wasn't enough to cover his medical bills, and she spent the rest of her life working 3 jobs to keep our house. I don't want money for that now, but I want you to admit it happened. I want it to be part of the record." Marcus looked around the circle of faces, each one representing a story of loss and resilience that he had never bothered to learn. These people weren't asking for revenge or enormous compensation. They were asking for recognition, for inclusion, for the basic dignity of being seen as human beings whose lives mattered. "If I agree to work with the community on modifying the development plans," Marcus said slowly, "will you consider ending this protest?" "If you agree to work with the community as equal partners in designing the development," Mrs. Kowalski corrected, "and if you agree to acknowledge Wellington Industries' history with the families in this neighborhood, then yes, we'll unlock these chains." Marcus looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. Then he looked back at the protesters, at the police officers waiting for instructions, at the construction equipment that represented millions in investment, at the reporters who were documenting every word for the evening news. He thought about his father, who would have called the protesters a threat to be eliminated through force or intimidation. He thought about the Wellington Industries Board, who would be furious about delays and cost overruns and community concessions that would cut into profit margins. He thought about his own future, about whether he was about to destroy everything he had worked to build. And then he thought about Mrs. Kowalski, sitting on her porch, talking about a man who had seemed to actually care what happened to the people in her neighborhood. "Mrs. Kowalski," Marcus said, "would you be willing to serve on a community advisory board that would have real authority over the development plans?" "Equal authority?" she asked. "Not just advisory, but actual decision-making power." Marcus took a deep breath. equal authority. The change in the atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The tension that had been crackling around the construction site seemed to dissipate as protesters began to smile and talk excitedly among themselves. The police sergeant looked relieved that he wouldn't have to arrest a dozen elderly ladies. Even the construction workers seemed to relax, no longer caught between conflicting orders about whether to continue working or shut down operations. But Marcus knew that making the promise was the easy part. Following through would require him to fundamentally change not just the South Side development, but the entire way Wellington Industries operated. He would have to convince a board of directors who cared primarily about quarterly profits to accept community input that would likely reduce returns on investment. He would have to restructure a company, culture built around top-down decision-making, to accommodate collaborative planning with people who had no business experience, but intimate knowledge of what their neighborhoods needed. Most difficult of all, he would have to confront the systematic injustices that Wellington Industries had perpetrated for decades, acknowledge responsibility for harm that couldn't be undone, and find ways to make amends that went beyond legal settlements and public relations gestures. As the protesters began unlocking their chains and folding up their chairs, Thomas approached Marcus quietly. "Are you sure you know what you just committed to?" "No," Marcus admitted. "But I know I can't keep pretending that the way we've been doing business is acceptable. The board is going to revolt. The shareholders are going to demand your removal. You could lose control of the company entirely." Marcus looked around at the neighborhood that would be transformed by his development. The small houses where families had struggled and survived for generations. The corner stores and community centers that served as anchors for people who had few other sources of stability. The children playing on sidewalks who would grow up in whatever community he chose to create. "Maybe losing control isn't the worst thing that could happen," Marcus said. "Maybe the worst thing would be keeping control and using it the same way my father did." The drive back to Wellington Tower was quiet. Thomas seemed lost in thought, and Marcus was trying to process the implications of what he had just agreed to do. By the time they reached downtown, night was falling, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle like stars in the windows of office buildings and apartment complexes. "I need to call an emergency board meeting," Marcus said as they pulled into the parking garage. "If I'm going to restructure the South Side development, I need to get board approval before the story hits the news." "Marcus," Thomas said as they walked toward the elevator, "there's something else you need to know. Something I haven't told you yet." Marcus felt his stomach drop. After everything he had learned in the past 8 hours, he wasn't sure he could handle another revelation about his family's hidden secrets. "What is it?" "The reason I came back wasn't just to stop the Southside development. It was because Harold left me something in his will, something he never told you about." The elevator doors opened and they stepped inside, but Marcus felt like he was falling even though they were rising. "What kind of something?" 51% of Wellington Industries, held in trust for 25 years, to be released to me if I ever returned to claim it. Marcus stared at his uncle in shock. "That's impossible. I inherited the company. I own controlling interest. You own 49%. I checked the incorporation documents this morning with a lawyer downtown. Harold restructured the ownership in 1999, right after our final confrontation about the factory fire. He must have been planning for the possibility that I would come back someday." The elevator reached the 40th floor and the doors opened, but neither man moved. Marcus felt like his entire identity was disintegrating around him. Not only was the company built on a foundation of exploitation and cover-ups, but he didn't even actually own it. Everything he had believed about his inheritance, his authority, his position in the business world, was based on another one of Harold's elaborate deceptions. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. "Because I'm giving it to you, the 51%. I never wanted control of Wellington Industries, and I don't want it now, but I needed you to understand that you have a choice. You can continue running the company the way Harold taught you, focusing on profits and treating communities like obstacles to be overcome. Or you can use your position to transform Wellington Industries into something that actually serves the people whose labor creates its wealth." Marcus stepped out of the elevator and walked slowly toward his office, Thomas following behind him. The building was mostly empty now except for security guards and the occasional executive working late. Their footsteps echoed in the marble lobby like gunshots. "There's a condition," Thomas continued as they reached Marcus's office door. "If you accept my shares, you also accept responsibility for making amends to the families Wellington Industries has harmed. All of them, not just the ones on the south side. It will cost millions of dollars and require you to acknowledge publicly what the company has done." Marcus unlocked his office door and they went inside. The documents Thomas had brought were still scattered across the conference table, evidence of decades of systematic harm that Marcus would now have to answer for. The city lights beyond the windows looked different now, less like a kingdom he ruled and more like a community he was responsible for serving. "How many families are we talking about?" Marcus asked. "I've been tracking them for 25 years. 738 families who lost members to industrial accidents, chemical exposure, or environmental contamination caused by Wellington Industries facilities. Another 1,200 families who were displaced from their homes through intimidation or below-market buyouts to make way for expansions or waste disposal. Nearly 2,000 families." Marcus did quick calculations in his head. Even modest settlements and compensation packages would cost hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe more than the company could afford without selling major assets or taking on debt that would cripple operations for decades. "And if I refuse? Then I'll go public with everything I have. Transfer my shares to a community trust that will use them to force changes through shareholder activism, and spend whatever time I have left making sure Wellington Industries faces legal consequences for its actions." Marcus walked to the window and looked down at the city his family had helped shape. Somewhere out there, Mrs. Kowalski was probably sitting in her kitchen, making dinner and wondering whether the wealthy businessman who had promised to include the community in development decisions would actually follow through. Somewhere out there, David Morrison was working late in his law office, processing contracts for a company built on the foundation of his father's death, not knowing that the uncle he thought was dead was back and demanding justice for crimes David didn't even know had been committed. Somewhere out there, hundreds of families were living with the consequences of choices that Harold Wellington had made decades earlier. Choices that had prioritized corporate profits over human welfare and left scars that had never healed. "If I agree to this," Marcus said without turning from the window, "I won't just be risking the company. I'll be admitting that my entire life has been built on blood money. Everything I've achieved, everything I own, every relationship I have that's connected to Wellington Industries, it will all be tainted by association with what my father did." "Yes," Thomas said simply. "It will be. And you think that's a price worth paying?" "I think it's a debt that's already overdue." Marcus closed his eyes and tried to imagine what his life would look like if he accepted Thomas's challenge. He would have to face not only the Wellington Industries board, but also investors, business partners, community leaders, and media outlets that would want explanations for decades of corporate misconduct. He would have to rebuild relationships with employees who might lose respect for him when they learned about the company's history. He would have to reconstruct his entire sense of identity around something other than being Harold Wellington's successful son. But he would also have the chance to transform Wellington Industries into something that actually deserved the loyalty and respect it had demanded from workers and communities for so long. He would have the opportunity to create jobs that didn't endanger lives, to develop properties that strengthened rather than displaced communities, to build a legacy based on contribution rather than extraction. "There's someone I need to call," Marcus said. He picked up his phone and dialed David Morrison's direct number. The lawyer answered on the second ring, sounding tired but alert. "David, it's Marcus. I need you to come to my office immediately. There's something you need to know about your father's death, and something I need your help with." "Marcus, it's almost 9 o'clock. Can't this wait?" "Until..." "No, it can't wait. David, I'm about to make decisions that will change everything about Wellington Industries, and I need legal counsel from someone I trust completely. Can you be here in 20 minutes? There was a pause. "Is everything all right?" "No, everything is not all right, but I'm hoping we can make it better." While they waited for David Morrison to arrive, Marcus and Thomas sat in the conference room going through the documents that would form the foundation of Wellington Industries' reckoning with its past. Thomas had organized everything meticulously: medical records, safety violation reports, environmental impact studies, financial records showing payments to silence victims and their families. "How did you get all of this?" Marcus asked, holding up an internal memo from 1987 discussing the cost-benefit analysis of installing safety equipment versus paying settlements to injured workers. "Some of it I took when I left the company. Some I obtained through public records requests over the years. Some came from families who kept documentation, hoping that someday they would get justice." Thomas pointed to a stack of death certificates. "And some came from Harold himself. My father gave you evidence of his own crimes. Your father was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He knew that someday there would be an accounting for what Wellington Industries had done. He kept meticulous records of everything, partly to protect himself legally, partly because he genuinely believed he was making necessary sacrifices for the greater good of the company and the family." Marcus picked up one of the death certificates. Maria Santos, age 28, died of respiratory failure caused by chemical exposure. The date was 1995, which meant Maria Santos had been younger than Marcus was now when she died from breathing toxins at a Wellington Industries facility. "Did she have children?" Marcus asked. Thomas checked a corresponding file folder. "2 daughters, ages 4 and 6 when she died. The husband received a settlement of $75,000 in exchange for not pursuing legal action." $75,000. Marcus spent more than that on wine in a good year. It was less than he had paid for the watch he was currently wearing. For a man whose wife had died because Wellington Industries had chosen cheaper, more dangerous chemicals over safe alternatives, $75,000 was an insult disguised as compensation. "Are they still alive, the daughters?" "I don't know. I lost track of some families over the years, especially when they moved away from Chicago. But if you're serious about making amends, we'll need to hire investigators to track down everyone we can find." David Morrison arrived as they were discussing the logistics of locating nearly 2,000 families across several decades. Marcus had known David for 8 years, but seeing him walk into the conference room where evidence of his father's death was spread across the table was surreal. David looked like what his father might have become if he had lived: successful, confident, well-dressed, carrying himself with the authority of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "Marcus, what's going on? Why did you need me here so urgently?" David stopped when he saw Thomas sitting at the conference table. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met." "David." "Morrison," Marcus said. "I'd like you to meet Thomas Wellington, my uncle." David's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "I thought, didn't he die years ago?" "That's what everyone was supposed to think," Thomas said, standing to shake David's hand. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, but there are things you need to know about your father's death and Wellington Industries' role in it." Marcus watched David's face as Thomas explained the circumstances of the 1999 factory fire, the safety violations that had caused it, and Harold Wellington's decision to cover up the company's responsibility rather than face the legal and financial consequences of admitting fault. David said nothing during the explanation, but Marcus could see his lawyer's mind processing the information, cataloguing the legal implications and personal betrayals that each revelation represented. "My father died because Wellington Industries knowingly operated unsafe." "Equipment?" David asked when Thomas finished. "Your father died because my brother chose to prioritize cost savings over worker safety," Thomas said. "And I'm partially responsible because I knew about the unsafe conditions and didn't do enough to force changes before the accident happened." David sat down heavily in one of the conference room chairs. Marcus could see him struggling to reconcile this new information with everything he had believed about his relationship with Wellington Industries. For 8 years, David had served as the company's legal counsel, helping to structure deals and navigate regulations for the business built on the foundation of his father's death. "Why are you telling me this now?" David asked. "Because Marcus is about to transform Wellington Industries," Thomas said. "He's going to acknowledge the company's history, compensate the families we've harmed, and restructure operations to prevent future harm. And he's going to need legal counsel who understands what's at stake personally, not just financially." David looked at Marcus. "Is this true?" Are you really planning to admit to decades of corporate misconduct? I'm planning to take responsibility for what Wellington Industries has done and make sure it becomes the kind of company that your father and all the other people who died or were injured deserve to work for. Marcus could see David processing the implications of what he was being asked to do. As Wellington Industries legal counsel, David would be responsible for structuring settlements with hundreds of families, navigating regulatory investigations, and defending against lawsuits from investors who would be furious about the financial impact of the company's admissions. It would be the most challenging legal work of his career, and it would require him to essentially prosecute the company he had been defending for nearly a decade. "What do you need from me?" David asked. "Finally, I need you to help me figure out how to do this right," Marcus said. "How to make amends that actually matter, how to restructure the company so it can survive the financial impact, how to ensure that we're helping families rather than just protecting ourselves from liability." David nodded slowly. "This is going to destroy your reputation in the business community. You understand that, right? Once word gets out that Wellington Industries is admitting to systematic negligence and cover-ups, every business school case study will use you as an example of corporate irresponsibility. I think I'd rather be known for taking responsibility than for perpetuating harm," Marcus said. "And the financial impact could be enormous. We're talking about hundreds of millions in settlements, plus legal fees, plus the cost of restructuring operations, plus the loss of business relationships with partners who won't want to be associated with the scandal." "The company will survive," Thomas interjected. "Wellington Industries is profitable enough to absorb the costs, especially if we're smart about how we structure the settlements and operational changes. The real question is whether Marcus is prepared for the personal cost of choosing accountability over self-preservation." Marcus thought about Mrs. Kowalski, chaining herself to construction equipment because it was the only way she knew to make her voice heard. He thought about Maria Santos dying at 28 from chemical exposure, while her daughters waited for her to come home from work. He thought about David Chen, burning to death in a factory fire caused by equipment that Harold Wellington knew was dangerous. He thought about his father, writing letters to his estranged brother, and justifying a lifetime of moral compromises as necessary for family and business success. Harold Wellington had built an empire, but he had also built a legacy of harm that extended far beyond the company's financial statements. "I've been thinking about what it means to be a Wellington," Marcus said to David and Thomas. "For my entire life, I've thought it meant being successful in business, accumulating wealth, building something lasting to pass down to future generations. But maybe what it really means is taking responsibility for the harm our success has caused and using our resources to make things better." David pulled out his phone and began taking notes. "If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly and carefully. Once word leaks that Wellington Industries is planning major admissions and settlements, we'll be dealing with regulatory investigations, shareholder lawsuits, media attention, and probably criminal referrals. We need to control the narrative and the timeline. What do you recommend?" "First, we need a complete audit of every claim Thomas has documented. I'll need to verify the accuracy of the information and assess our legal exposure. Second, we need to develop a comprehensive settlement strategy that's fair to families but doesn't bankrupt the company. Third, we need a communication plan that explains what we're doing and why we're doing it, both to the business community and to the affected families." Thomas leaned forward. "And fourth, you need to prepare for the possibility that some families won't want settlements. Some of them may want their day in court, especially if they believe Wellington Industries has been covering up crimes rather than just accidents." "Are we talking about criminal charges?" Marcus asked. "Potentially," David said. "Knowingly exposing workers to dangerous conditions could constitute criminal negligence or even manslaughter, depending on the specific circumstances. And the cover-ups could be obstruction of justice or conspiracy charges." Marcus felt the weight of potential criminal liability settling around him like a straitjacket. He could be prosecuted not just for continuing his father's policies, but for participating in cover-ups that had been ongoing throughout his tenure as company president. Even if he personally hadn't known about specific incidents, he could be held responsible as the corporate officer, who should have known and should have taken action to address systemic problems. "How long do I have to make a decision about this?" Marcus asked. "Not long," Thomas said. "I've given you the information you need to understand what Wellington Industries has done and what it will cost to make amends. But I can't wait indefinitely for you to decide whether you're going to take responsibility or continue the cover-ups. And if I decide the cost is too high, if I choose to protect the company rather than compensate the families," Thomas's expression grew sad but determined, "then I'll go public with everything I have, and you'll be dealing with all the same legal and financial consequences, but without any control over how they unfold. At least if you take the initiative, you can manage the process and ensure that families are actually helped rather than just creating more legal chaos." Marcus looked around the conference room where his father had made the decisions that led to this moment. The choice to prioritize profits over safety, the choice to cover up accidents rather than preventing them, the choice to buy silence rather than seeking accountability. Harold Wellington had built an empire through those choices, but he had also built a reckoning that was now falling to his son to address. "I need to talk to the board," Marcus said finally. "I can't make decisions this significant without getting approval from the other directors." "The board is going to try to talk you out of it," David warned. "They're going to argue that admitting liability will expose the company to more lawsuits, that compensating past victims will encourage new claims, that acknowledging systematic problems will destroy business relationships and stock value. Then I'll have to convince them that doing the right thing is also the smart business decision in the long term." Thomas smiled for the first time since arriving at Marcus's office. "Harold always said you were more like me than like him. I think he was right." Marcus called an emergency board meeting for 8 o'clock the following morning, giving him less than 12 hours to prepare for what would probably be the most important presentation of his career. He spent the night in his office, working with David and Thomas to organize the evidence and develop a strategy for persuading 8 board members to approve the largest corporate accountability initiative in Wellington Industries history. The Wellington Industries Board of Directors included some of Chicago's most prominent business leaders, the former CEO of a major bank, a retired federal judge, the founder of a successful tech company, and several other executives who had been recruited over the years for their expertise and connections. They were all people who had built their careers on careful risk management and profit maximization, and they were not going to be enthusiastic about a proposal that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars while admitting to decades of corporate misconduct. Marcus arrived at the boardroom at 7:30, carrying boxes of documents and a presentation he had spent the night refining. Thomas had offered to attend the meeting, but Marcus had decided that introducing his supposedly dead uncle to the board while simultaneously asking them to approve massive settlements for industrial accidents would be too much change to process in a single meeting. By 8 o'clock, all 8 board members were present and looking curious about why they had been summoned on such short notice. Marcus had worked with these people for years, had earned their respect through consistent profitability and strategic growth, but he was about to test that relationship by asking them to support decisions that went against every business principle they had been trained to follow. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Marcus began. "I've called this emergency meeting because I've discovered information about Wellington Industries' history that requires immediate action." He spent the next hour laying out the evidence Thomas had provided, the safety violations, the cover-ups, the systematic harm to workers and communities, the families who had been silenced through settlements and intimidation. He showed them death certificates, medical reports, internal memos documenting Harold Wellington's knowledge of dangerous conditions, and financial records proving that the company had chosen profit over safety repeatedly and systematically. The board members' reactions ranged from shock to skepticism to barely controlled anger. Margaret Chen, the former federal judge, was the first to speak when Marcus finished his presentation. "Marcus, assuming this information is accurate, we're looking at potential criminal liability for current management as well as historical misconduct. Are you certain you want to open this can of worms?" "I don't think we have a choice," Marcus replied. "The information exists whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is whether we take responsibility proactively, or wait for it to be exposed by hostile parties who won't be concerned about the company's survival. Robert Fitzgerald, the former bank CEO, leaned forward in his chair. Marcus, I understand your moral concerns, but we have fiduciary responsibilities to current shareholders. Admitting to systematic negligence and paying hundreds of millions in settlements will destroy shareholder value and could force the company into bankruptcy. The company is profitable enough to absorb the costs without going bankrupt, Marcus said. And if we don't address these issues voluntarily, we could face much larger costs through criminal prosecutions and civil lawsuits that we won't be able to control. Or, said Patricia Williams, who had founded a successful software company before joining the Wellington board, we could keep this information confidential and continue operating as we have been. The families affected by historical incidents have already received settlements. Most of the incidents happened decades ago. Why create new problems by reopening old wounds? Marcus looked around the table at 8 successful business leaders who had built their careers on the foundation of calculated risk management and profit optimization. They were good people in their personal lives, charitable donors, community volunteers, loving parents and grandparents. But in the boardroom, they were trained to think about abstract, financial interests rather than concrete human consequences. Because, Marcus said quietly, Mrs. Agnes Kowalski chained herself to a bulldozer yesterday to protest the development project that would displace her from the home where she's lived since her husband died from chemical burns in one of our factories. Because David Morrison, our legal counsel, doesn't know that his father died in a fire caused by safety equipment we knew was defective. Because 738 families have been carrying the burden of our choices for decades, while we've pretended their suffering was just the cost of doing business. The room was quiet for a long moment. Marcus could see the board members processing not just the legal and financial implications of what he was proposing, but also the moral weight of the choices they were being asked to make. Finally, Margaret Chen spoke again. Marcus, what exactly are you asking us to approve? I'm asking you to approve a comprehensive accountability initiative that includes acknowledging Wellington Industries' responsibility for historical harm, compensating affected families fairly, restructuring our operations to prevent future harm, and committing to transparency and community engagement in all future business decisions. And what will this cost? Marcus looked at the financial projections David had prepared during their all-night planning session. Between $400 and $600 million over 5 years, depending on how many families we're able to locate, and what level of compensation is appropriate for different types of harm. Robert Fitzgerald whistled softly. That's more than our annual profit margin. We'd have to take on significant debt or sell major assets to fund this initiative. We'd also have to restructure operations to include community input in development decisions, which could reduce profitability on future projects, added Patricia Williams. And we'd be setting a precedent that could encourage other companies' stakeholders to demand similar accountability for historical misconduct, said board member James Liu. Marcus could see the conversation moving toward rejection of his proposal. The board members were doing what they had been trained to do, protecting the financial interests of the company and its shareholders, minimizing risk exposure, maintaining profitable operations. From a traditional business perspective, voluntarily admitting to systematic misconduct and paying hundreds of millions in settlements was irrational. But Marcus thought about the protesters who had chained themselves to construction equipment, not out of malice or greed, but out of desperation to be heard by people who had the power to change their lives. He thought about families who had spent decades dealing with the consequences of Wellington Industries' choices, while the company continued to profit from the same practices that had caused their suffering. I understand your concerns about the financial impact, Marcus said, but I want you to consider the cost of doing nothing. If this information becomes public without our proactive response, we'll face congressional investigations, criminal prosecutions, civil lawsuits, and a public relations disaster that could destroy the company entirely. At least if we take the initiative, we can control the process and ensure that the company survives, while actually helping the families we've harmed. Margaret Chen nodded thoughtfully. There's also the reputational benefit of being seen as a company that takes responsibility for its mistakes rather than covering them up. In today's business environment, corporate accountability can actually be a competitive advantage, but only if we manage the narrative carefully, added Patricia Williams. If this is perceived as an admission of ongoing criminal activity rather than historical mistakes we're trying to correct, it could destroy business relationships and make it impossible to attract quality employees or business partners. Marcus felt a spark of hope. The board wasn't rejecting his proposal outright. They were trying to figure out how to implement it in a way that served both moral and business interests. What if we phase the implementation, suggested James Liu. Start with the most clear-cut cases where our liability is obvious, demonstrate our commitment to accountability, and then expand the program based on the response from families and the business community. We could also structure it as a restorative justice initiative rather than a legal settlement program, added Robert Fitzgerald. Frame it as Wellington Industries taking leadership in corporate social responsibility rather than admitting to criminal conduct. David Morrison, who had been taking notes throughout the meeting, looked up from his legal pad. From a legal perspective, we need to be careful about how we characterize historical incidents. We can acknowledge harm and provide compensation without necessarily admitting criminal liability. But we also can't misrepresent what happened. Families deserve honest acknowledgement of how they were affected. Margaret Chen turned to Marcus. Have you considered what happens to your own position if we move forward with this initiative? You'll be personally associated with admitting to decades of corporate misconduct. That could affect your ability to serve as an effective CEO, both within the company and in the broader business community. Marcus had been dreading this question because he knew the answer would determine not just his career, but his entire identity. For 35 years he had been Marcus Wellington, son of the legendary Harold Wellington, heir to an industrial empire, respected businessman in his own right. If Wellington Industries publicly acknowledged systematic misconduct spanning decades, Marcus would become the CEO who admitted his family's company had been built on exploitation and cover-ups. But he would also become the CEO who chose accountability over self-preservation, who used corporate resources to help rather than harm communities, who transformed a company built on extraction into one based on contribution. I've thought about it, Marcus said, and I think I'd rather be known as the Wellington who took responsibility than the one who continued the cover-ups. The vote was closer than Marcus had hoped, but decisive enough to move forward. 5 board members supported the accountability initiative, with modifications to protect the company's legal exposure and manage the financial impact over a longer time frame. 3 members voted against, arguing that the risks outweighed the potential benefits. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself living in a world that seemed to shift beneath his feet. Daily, David Morrison worked 18-hour days structuring the legal framework for what they were calling the Wellington Industries Community Restoration Initiative. Thomas emerged from his 25-year exile to serve as a liaison with affected families, helping to locate people who had been scattered across the country and explain the company's new approach to addressing historical harm. The first public announcement came 6 weeks after Marcus's conversation with the board. Standing at a podium in the Southside Community Center, surrounded by Mrs. Kowalski and the other protesters who had chained themselves to construction equipment, Marcus read a prepared statement that had been reviewed by lawyers, public relations consultants, and community advocates. Wellington Industries acknowledges that our historical business practices caused harm to workers and community members that was both preventable and unacceptable. We take full responsibility for safety, violations, environmental damage, and cover-ups that prioritized corporate profits over human welfare. Today, we are announcing the Wellington Industries Community Restoration Initiative, a 5-year, $500 million commitment to compensate affected families, restore damaged communities, and ensure that our future operations serve the people whose labor creates our success. The reaction was immediate and intense. Business publications questioned Marcus's sanity and predicted Wellington Industries would be bankrupt within 2 years. Labor organizations and community groups praised the initiative as a model for corporate accountability. Legal experts debated whether the company's admissions would expose it to criminal prosecution or provide protection against future lawsuits. But for Marcus, the most meaningful response came from Mrs. Kowalski, who approached him after the press conference with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Wellington," she said, "my husband would have been proud to know that someone from your family finally had the courage to tell the truth." The process of implementing the Community Restoration Initiative was more complex and emotionally demanding than Marcus had anticipated. Each family's case required individual investigation to determine what had happened, what compensation was appropriate, and what form of assistance would be most helpful. Some families wanted financial settlements, others wanted medical assistance or educational scholarships for their children. Still others wanted nothing more than acknowledgement that their loved ones had not died in vain. Marcus insisted on meeting personally with as many families as possible, despite David Morrison's warnings that direct contact with affected parties could create legal liabilities. He sat in living rooms and community centers across Chicago and the Midwest, listening to stories of loss and resilience that made him understand the true cost of his father's business decisions. He met with Rosa Santos, whose mother Maria had died from chemical exposure in 1995. Rosa was now 32, a nurse working night shifts to support her own 2 children, still living in the same small apartment where she had grown up after her mother's death. "I don't want your money," Rosa told him when he explained the restoration initiative. "I want you to make sure this never happens to another family." He met with James Chen, David, Morrison's childhood friend, whose father had also died in the 1999 factory fire. James had spent years angry at David for working for Wellington Industries, not understanding why his friend would represent the company that had killed their fathers. "David never knew the truth about what happened," Marcus explained. "Your father's death was covered up so thoroughly that even our own legal counsel didn't understand the company's responsibility." He met with dozens of other families, each with their own story of how Wellington Industries' choices had affected their lives. Some were angry and demanded justice. Others were gracious and focused on ensuring future safety. All of them deserved better than they had received from Harold Wellington's version of the company. The transformation of Wellington Industries took 3 years to complete. The South Side development was redesigned through genuine collaboration with community representatives, resulting in a mixed-income neighborhood that included affordable housing, space for existing businesses, and community facilities funded by the company. The Community Restoration Initiative located and compensated 892 families, with settlements ranging from medical assistance to full college scholarships to cash payments that allowed people to buy homes or start businesses. More importantly, the company's operations were restructured to include community input in all major decisions. Environmental, safety measures that exceeded regulatory requirements, and worker safety protocols that treated employees as partners rather than expendable resources. The financial impact was significant, but not catastrophic. Wellington Industries had to sell some assets and take on debt to fund the restoration initiative, but the company remained profitable and actually attracted new business from clients who wanted to work with an organization known for accountability and community engagement. Marcus's personal transformation was more dramatic than the company's. The business community's initial skepticism gave way to grudging respect as Wellington Industries demonstrated that corporate responsibility could coexist with profitability. Marcus was invited to speak at business schools and corporate responsibility conferences about the challenges and benefits of voluntary accountability initiatives. But the most important change was in his relationship with his own identity. For the first time in his life, Marcus understood what it meant to be a Wellington in a way that he could be proud of, not as the heir to an empire built on exploitation, but as someone who used inherited privilege to create positive change. The story reached its conclusion on a warm September evening, 3 years after Mrs. Kowalski had chained herself to construction equipment. Marcus stood in the community center at the heart of the transformed South Side development, surrounded by families who had benefited from the Community Restoration Initiative, board members who had supported the company's transformation, and community leaders who had helped design the new approach to development. Thomas Wellington, now officially reinstated as a Wellington Industries board member and community liaison, approached his nephew with a manila envelope. "What's this?" Marcus asked. "The deed to 1247 Ashland Avenue. Mrs. Kowalski wanted you to have it as a reminder of where this journey started." Marcus opened the envelope and found not just the deed, but a handwritten note from Mrs. Kowalski. "Mr. Wellington, you kept your promise to include the community in deciding how our neighborhood would change. My husband would have been proud to know that the Wellington name came to mean something good. Keep this deed as a reminder that sometimes the most important signatures are the ones that commit us to doing better." Marcus looked around the community center at the faces of people whose lives had been affected by his family's choices, some harmed by Harold Wellington's decisions, others helped by the restoration initiative Marcus had implemented, all of them part of a community that was stronger because someone had finally chosen accountability over self-preservation. David Morrison approached, carrying his infant son who would grow up in a world where his grandfather's death had been acknowledged and his father's work contributed to healing, rather than harm. "Any regrets?" David asked. Marcus thought about the question seriously. He had lost some business relationships and faced criticism from parts of the business community. The company was smaller and less profitable than it would have been if he had continued Harold's approach to growth. His personal net worth had declined significantly due to the resources devoted to the restoration initiative, but he had gained relationships with community members who saw him as a partner rather than a threat. He had built a company that employees were proud to work for and that communities welcomed rather than feared. He had transformed the Wellington name from a symbol of exploitation into a model of corporate responsibility. Most importantly, he had learned what Thomas had tried to teach Harold decades earlier, that true success wasn't measured by the wealth you accumulated, but by the positive impact you had on the people whose lives intersected with yours. "No regrets," Marcus said, looking around at the community that had been built through collaboration rather than conquest. "I think this is what my grandfather would have wanted Wellington Industries to become if he had lived to see what his legacy turned into." Thomas smiled and put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I think you're right, and I think your father would have been proud of you for having the courage to choose a different path." As the evening wound down and people began to leave the community center, Marcus walked outside to look at the neighborhood that had been transformed through the Community Restoration Initiative. The streets were lined with new housing that families could actually afford, small businesses that served the community's needs, and community spaces where children could play safely. Mrs. Kowalski's house was still there, renovated but not replaced, surrounded by a small garden she had planted with help from volunteers coordinated through Wellington Industries' community engagement program. She had chosen to stay in the neighborhood where she had lived for 7 decades, but now she was surrounded by a community that had been strengthened rather than displaced by development. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Sarah, his assistant who had stayed with the company through all the changes and challenges of the past 3 years. "Sarah, I need you to schedule a meeting with the board for next week. I want to discuss expanding the Community Restoration Initiative to other cities where Wellington Industries has operations." "All of them, sir?" Marcus looked up at the stars that were barely visible through the Chicago sky, thinking about all the communities across the country where Wellington Industries facilities operated, all the families whose lives were affected by the company's choices, all the opportunities to choose contribution over extraction. "All of them," he said. "It's time to make sure the Wellington name means something good wherever it's known." Marcus Wellington walked back toward his car, carrying the deed to Mrs. Kowalski's house, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important signature you can make is the one that commits you to being better than you were before. The city lights reflected off the windows of the community center behind him, illuminating a neighborhood where families could build their lives without fear that the companies they worked for would value their labor more than their lives. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text message from Thomas. "Harold would be proud of the man you've become. The Wellington name finally means what our father hoped it would." Marcus smiled and started his car, already thinking about tomorrow's work and the communities that still needed to know that some signatures represent not just business deals, but promises to do better, to be better, to use power in service of the people who make that power possible. The signature that had started everything, Thomas Wellington's name on a property acquisition contract, had led to the discovery that the most important thing you can inherit isn't wealth or status or empire, but the opportunity to choose what kind of legacy you want to leave behind. And sometimes, the best way to honor your family's name is to transform what it means to carry it. As Marcus drove through the Chicago streets toward his downtown apartment, he passed construction sites and community centers, small businesses and family homes, all of them part of a city that was stronger because someone had finally learned that true success isn't measured by what you take from the world, but by what you give back to it. The glass he had dropped in Desperation 3 years earlier had shattered on his office floor, but from those broken pieces, he had built something better, a company that served communities, a legacy worth inheriting, and a signature that meant something worth signing your name to. In the distance, the Wellington Tower rose against the Chicago skyline, its windows glowing with the lights of people working late to build something that would last, not because it was profitable, but because it was right. And at the top of that tower, in the office where Harold Wellington had once made choices that prioritized profits over people, a new kind of decision was being made every day. The choice to do better, to be better, to make the Wellington name a symbol of hope rather than harm. The story that had begun with a signature no one should have been able to make had become a story about signatures that committed a family to becoming worthy of the loyalty they had demanded for so long. And sometimes, that's the most important story anyone can tell, the story of choosing to be better than you were, even when it costs everything you thought you wanted, because you finally learned what you actually need. Marcus Wellington drove through his city, carrying in his heart the knowledge that his signature would never again appear on a document that put profits ahead of people, and that the next generation of Wellingtons would inherit not just wealth, but the even greater treasure of a name that stood for something worth standing for.